It's our last opportunity to learn together before Rosh Hashanah. So I want to wish everyone a K'tivah v'chatima tova. Now, speaking of Rosh Hashanah, of course, the Iker mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah is the mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar, and therefore we're going to kind of delve deep into the mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar, not necessarily the halachic details associated with Tkiyat Shofar, but more the philosophical ideas represented by the shofar, the mystical ideas represented by the shofar. And I want to begin just with two stories about shofar, kind of to set the tone. The first story is a story about Rav Moshe Soloveitchik. Rav Moshe Soloveitchik was the father of Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, Zatzal. And Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, before he came to America to be one of the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshivat Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, which would become Yeshiva University, and of course his son Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik eventually succeeds him as the Rosh Yeshiva in Ritz. But before he came to America, he was the Rav in a community in an area known as White Russia. The community was called Kaslovich. Kaslovich. So this is a story attributed to Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, during that time that he was the Rav in Kaslovich. It's a story that Rabbi Soloveitchik, his son, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, brings in his famous work, Ish Halacha, Halachic Man. And you can find it in the Hebrew version on page 57, and the English version on page 58. But we're just going to read from the Hebrew version. And here's the story. Ma'aseh ba'Abba Mari, he says, there was a story concerning my father. She'amad ala bima b'Rosh Hashanah, when he was standing on the bima on Rosh Hashanah, muchan u'muzuman l'sader tatakiyot. He was going to be what's called the makri. Moshe Soloveitchik was the Rav in the community, and he was the one who was going to call out the various sounds that the Baal Tokeah, the shofar blower, would then sound. And then he says, Hatokeah, the Baal Tokeah, Michasidei Chabad. He was a Chabadnik. Ish Yara Elokim, Sheyado Haito Rechava b'Mishnatel Sha'arav Zaken Zal. Okay, he was a pious individual with deep faith and deep emunah in Hashem, who also had at his fingertips all the knowledge, both halachic knowledge tradition, as well as the mystical tradition of the Admor HaZaken, the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, or Shner Zalman of Liadi. Hitchil Levakot. So that Baal Tokeah, before he sounded the shofar, or as he was sounding the shofar, he began to cry. He was so overwhelmed with the emotional significance of the moment, okay, and the kavanot that he had in sounding the shofar, that he began to cry. Nena Abba Mari Valmar, my father was taken aback, and therefore he answered and said, He said to the Baal Tokeah, Habocha ata b'shat netilat lulav? Do you also cry when you take the lulav? V'lama zed tifke b'tkiyat shofar? And if not, why are you crying now when we sound the shofar? Ha'ein shteihem mitzvot Hashem? Are they not both mitzvahs of Hashem? So Rabbi Soloveitchik uses the story to talk about the balance we have between reverence and emotion, okay? And there's a delicate balance that we kind of weave and that we kind of walk between reverence for Hashem and our own emotions. And it's very interesting. So in this story, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik says, you're so moved by Tkiyat Shofar, but really we should be equally moved by what? By every mitzvah. Are you also emotional when you drop a few coins in the pushka? Are you also emotional when you wake up in the morning and wash Negelwasser? If these are mitzvahs of Hashem, then and there are opportunities for us to feel that closeness and that spiritual reverberation within us, then we should be moved equally by every mitzvah. Okay, so, but one could also say, and learn from this story what? That somehow there's a unique emotional, metaphysical power to this particular mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar. Okay, and that's what we're going to focus on together today. I want to share one other story. This is a story attributed to Rav Kook. Rav Kook, as we know, after World War I, he comes on Aliyah, first to Yafo, then he goes on a fundraising trip to Europe as World War I is breaking out. He ends up getting stuck in Europe for almost 3 years. And then he returns, comes back to Israel, and he becomes the rabbi in Yerushalayim and the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community throughout Eretz Israel. And he lives in Yerushalayim for the last 14 or 15 years of his life. Anyways, so there you can actually go to, there's a little museum in what was Rav Kook's house. It's called Beit Rav Kook, and they made a little museum there. You can actually see Rav Kook's study. You can see the original Beit Midrash and Shul that was attached there, where Rav Kook launched the great yeshiva that would become Yeshivat Merkaz Rav Kook, named in his memory. Anyways, this story takes place in the late 1920s. And that house where he lived is just a few minutes walk from the Ben Yehuda pedestrian mall. And the story goes as follows, and I think it's Rosh Hashanah 1927, might be 1928, I don't remember the exact year. It became clear to Rav Kook that the area that was being constructed, which is now the Ben Yehuda pedestrian mall, that construction site was going to continue throughout Rosh Hashanah. And it also became known to Rav Kook that many of the workers who were going to be involved in that work over Rosh Hashanah were Jewish. And Rav Kook, of course, was very, very troubled by this. Chil Yantif in the middle of Yerushalayim, Yer Kodesh, bothered him. And the fact that the situation was that so many Jews were in such a difficult financial strait that they would feel compelled to work throughout Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah morning comes, and Rav Kook comes into shul, and he turns to one of his gabayim, and he hands him a shofar. And he says to this gabbai, he says, I want you to go to the construction site. I want to be perfectly clear. You're not to say one harsh word to anyone working there. Just simply, I want you to go there, say the brachot of that we say before Tekiyat Shofar as loudly as you can, and nothing else, and then simply sound the shofar, the first 30 blasts of the shofar, and then come back to shul. So if Rav Kook gives you a mission, of course the Gabbai followed the Rav's instructions, and he went to the construction site, did exactly what Rav Kook told him. And sure enough, many of the workers, not all of them, but many of the workers put down their tools and followed the Gabbai back to shul to daven Musaf. So at the end of Musaf, the Gabbai goes over to Rav Kook and says, Rebbe, I don't understand. Had you gone to the construction site, the sight of the chief rabbi coming would have caused such embarrassment that they all would have stopped working. So Rav Kook put his arm around the Gabbai and says, my dear friend, he says, no, what you don't understand is that as much as the Chilul Yantif pained me, what pained me more was to think that any of our brothers would go through the entire 2 days of Rosh Hashanah without hearing the sweet sounds of the shofar. So you learn a lot from the story about who Rav Kook was in terms of how and also we learn a lot in terms of how we inspire people versus talking down and criticizing people. But what concerned Rav Kook more than the work and the Chilul Yantiv was the fact that they would not be able to mekayim the Iker mitzvah of hearing the shofar sounded on Rosh Hashanah. So with these two stories as our introduction, that emotional push-pull, that tug that we all feel when we hear Tekiyat Shofar, that's what we're going to try to delve into this together in a few moments together this afternoon. Okay, so we're going to begin. We all know the famous Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. Now we're on our sheets. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us, Ami Rebbe Abba Lama Taka B'Shofar Sha'ayil. Why do we sound a ram's horn? Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Tiku Lefanai B'Shofar Sha'ayil Kidei She'eskor Lachem Akeda Yitzchak Ben Avraham. Umale ani aleichem ki ilu akadatam atzmachem lefanai. He says, why do we sound the shofar? To remember the story of the Akedah Yitzchak. And when you sound the shofar, it'll be considered just as Yitzchak was ready to sacrifice himself, and Avram was ready to sacrifice his son. It'll be considered as if what? You're ready to sacrifice yourself before me as well. Now, we're going to just quickly skip through the next. The few psukim are here. We know that on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the story. The first day of Rosh Hashanah, the Kriyat Torah, is the story of the birth of Yitzchak. And on the second day of Rosh Hashanah is the story of Akedah Yitzchak. And we all know that towards the end of the Akedah Yitzchak, when Avraham is told by Hashem not to go through with shechting his son, instead there is an ayil, a ram that gets its horn stuck in the thicket, and that ram is offered in place of Yitzchak. And therefore, many learn this Gemara, okay, and assume that the connection between the story of Akedah Yitzchak and the shofar is that story that we read about on the second day of Rosh Hashanah of the ayil of the ram getting its horn stuck in the thicket, and therefore we sound the ram's horn to recall that moment. But as we're going to see together now, if you turn to page 3. So we're going to see together now, perhaps there's a lot more going on, because what happens immediately after chronologically in the Torah? What happens chronologically? The next Sedra is Parsha Chayei Sarah. A Parsha Chayei Sarah begins with a description of the days of the life of Sarah Imenu's life, and that she passes away. This is text number 3 on our sheets. These are the days of Sarah's life: 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. Shnei Chayei Sarah. These were the years of Sarah's life. V'tamat Sarah b'Kiryat Arba, and Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, Hebron, which is also known as Hebron, be'eretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan. V'yavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'lifkota, and Avraham came to eulogize Sarah and to cry for her, to wail for her. And now, in a famous comment of Rashi on these psukim, take a look at text number 4. Lispod l'Sarah v'lifkota, v'nispacha mitat Sarah l'Akedah Yitzchak. The passing of Sarah it appears immediately after the story of the binding of Isaac. Lefish al yidei b'sarah ta'akedah, because when Sarah heard the news that her son had been prepared to be a sacrifice, shenizdamam b'na l'shchita v'chamat shelo nishchat, and he was prepared to be sacrificed, and at the last minute he wasn't slaughtered. Parcha nishmata mimena umeta. Her soul departs from her, and she passes away. So seemingly, Sarah dies either from shock, or from anguish, or out of piercing concern for her son, or brokenheartedness that her elderly husband could do this to her, their only son, whatever it may be. Seemingly, Sarah dies at that moment out of some kind of emotional crisis. Okay, but the Rebbe of Piasetzna, the Eish Kodesh, the rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, in a very powerful essay, he actually offers a very different interpretation and understanding of this Rashi. We're going to learn this piece from the Eish Kodesh here together now. That's text number 5. We're going to learn together in a moment. And then hopefully we're going to take this message that the Eish Kodesh finds within this opinion of Rashi, okay, that we just learned together, of her soul departing because she heard of the Akedah and the stressful circumstance, the trauma that her beloved son went through. And we're going to see that perhaps this is a clue to understanding another deeper message inherent in Tekiyat Shofar. Okay, so we're just going to jump right in. And he quotes, Piasetzna quotes this text number 5. V'nei Rashi Piresh. And we know that Rashi explains, "V'lama nismecha mitat Sarah l'Akedah Yitzchak, she'alidei b'sar ta'akedah v'kulei parcha nishmata mimena umeta." Okay, and he says, we know the Rashi. The Rashi says that the reason why the story of Sarah's death follows immediately after the Akedah is because there's a medrash. It says Sarah heard that her son was about to be shechted, and she dies of shock or a broken heart or whatever, however you want to interpret that Rashi. Okay, so now listen to what the Piasetzna Rebbe does with that Rashi. Hainu. What do we learn from this Rashi? Shemoshe Rabbeinu Raya Mehimna, that Hashem's trusted servant, a trusted shepherd, Moshe Rabbeinu, Samach mitad Sarah l'Akedah Yitzchak, Kedei lahamlitz tov b'yadenu. Listen to this idea. He says it's Moshe Rabbeinu who places these two episodes immediately one after the other. Okay? They didn't necessarily happen in a split second later. It's Moshe Rabbeinu who places these two episodes one after the other. Why? In order to advocate on our behalf, ulaharot, and demonstrate to Hashem, because if Hashem puts us through too much trauma in our life, and too much pain in our life, what could happen? Chas shalom, sheparcha nishmata, her soul departs. And again, it is a powerful interpretation of the Rashi to begin with, but when you contextualize where he's saying this in the Warsaw Ghetto where they've witnessed and experienced so much trauma and pain, okay? And then he continues, and even more so, if this is true of Sarah, tzadeket gedola kazu, such a great tzadekis, as Rashi tells us, based on the Chazal, that she was, at the age of 100, she was as free from sin as she was when she was 20. And at the age of 20 she was as innocent as she was when she was 7. And all her years are equal in goodness, according to the Rashi. Umikol makom, this is true about Sarah, umikol makom lo yichala lisbol yisurim kashim, and despite her great Amunah and tzidkus and righteousness, she couldn't withstand too much pain and suffering and trauma. Even more so. Even more so, it's true for us, simple human beings. And now he continues. But you could say even more than this. Shagam Sarah imenu atzma. And even Sarah herself. It's not just that Moshe does this to demonstrate to Hashem you can't expect the Jewish people to suffer too much, but you could say even that Sarah herself demonstrates this. Why? Because she took to heart so strongly this trauma that her son was experiencing until what? Until literally her soul departed from her. Okay? L'tovat Yisrael Sata. We could say what she did this not only for her own sake, but for the sake of all future generations of the Jewish people. L'harot la'Hashem, to demonstrate to Hashem, to say to Hashem what? You can't expect the Jewish people to suffer too much, to experience too much trauma. Even someone who, through the kindness of God, survives even after his suffering and his struggle, okay? That a portion of their spirit, of their intellect, of their emotions has been broken and lost from them. What difference does it make if half of me is destroyed or if I'm completely destroyed? It's a Mamer Chazal that he quotes. Now he brings this all together. And this is why the pasuk concludes once again. These are the years of Sarah's life. Because you might think at first glance, if Sarah hadn't given up her soul at that moment, if she hadn't taken the trauma that her child experienced so strongly, okay, then she might have had more years to live. And therefore, we might think what? That Sarah sinned against the additional years that were due her. But since she did this for the sake of the good of the Jewish people, for future generations of Am Yisrael, that they shouldn't have to experience such trauma, okay? We could say that she did this to the good of the Jewish people. And therefore, the pasuk tells us, okay, Shnei Chayei Sarah. Hainu Shnoteh Shel Achar Kuf Kav Zayin Kulam Shava Latova. Okay, the years that were due her after the 127 she actually lived, all of them are equal in their goodness as to the 127 years she did live. And really we could say that even against those years she didn't sin. Why? Because she did this to advocate on behalf of the Jewish people. Lachein, then let's how the Rebbe ends this. Lachein yirachim Hashem aleinu. Therefore Hashem should have compassion on us, v'al kol Yisrael, and on all the Jewish people. He's saying this in the Warsaw Ghetto. V'yoshienu b'mheira b'ruchnius v'gafnius. of Gufnius, Bechasad and Niglaim. And that Hashem should rescue us speedily, both spiritually and physically, through great, wondrous kindness. Okay. So Sarah, if we just go with this very out there, deep interpretation of our Rashi. Rashi quotes the Mamar Chazal that Sarah hears about the Akedah. She's so broken by it that she gives up her neshama. The Piasetzer Rebbe takes it a step further and says, no, that this was done to demonstrate and advocate on behalf of all generations of the Jewish people, not just her son, her child, her physical, biological child, Yitzchak, but for all subsequent children of the Jewish people, Sarah Imenu, okay? She does this in order to advocate on behalf of all future Doros, that Hashem, you can't expect the Jewish people to suffer too much, okay? So that's a very powerful idea. It's a very powerful ma'amar that really we need to take to heart. But now I'm going to ask, what does this all have to do with Tekiyat Shofar? So if you turn your page, there's a powerful medrash in the Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar that I saw quoted in Professor Aviva Zorenberg's beautiful book on Sefer Breshit. And Professor Zorenberg, this is text number 6, okay, which is Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, this is the translation of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer as found in Professor Zorenberg's beautiful Sefer on Bereshis. When Avraham came from Har Moriah, the Satan was furious that he had failed to realize his lust to abort Avraham's attempted sacrifice, okay? What did he do? He went off and told Sarah, Sarah, have you not heard what's been happening in the world? She replied, no. Listen to this medrash. He said, your old elderly husband has taken the boy Yitzchak and sacrificed him as a burnt offering, while the boy cried and wailed in his helplessness. Okay? So, according to this medrash, the Satan came to Sarah and said, what? Avram shechted Yitzchak. Immediately she began to cry and wail. She cried 3 sobs corresponding to the 3 tekiah notes of the shofar. And she wailed 3 times corresponding to the yavava, which is the shvarim, the staccato notes of the shofar. Then she gave up her spirit and died. Avram came and found her dead, as it said, and Avram came to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. The shofar's broken sounds represent what? Sarah's wailing on behalf of Yitzchak. So 1 second, he was 37 years old. So 1 second, if we combine these two concepts, okay? The shofar represents the wails of Sarah. And as we learned that Sarah, from the Piasetzer Rebbe, Sarah is not only wailing and didn't only give up her soul on behalf of Yitzchak, but on behalf of us. And therefore, we could suggest that one of the messages inherent in the sounds of the shofar ad hayom is to remind us that no matter what trauma we're facing, no matter what we're struggling with, we have an eternal advocate in Shemayim who's calling out on our behalf. The sounds of the shofar remind us that no matter what trauma we're experiencing, Sarah Imenu continues to cry out on our behalf in Shemayim and say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Genacht, enough trauma. The Jewish people have experienced enough trauma. So that's one powerful idea inherent and represented by the sounds of the shofar. Okay. One of the psukim that the Baal Tekeah recites, okay, before he makes the brachos on Rosh Hashanah morning, is this pasuk: Ashrei ha'am yodei TORAH. Okay, praiseworthy are the people that knows the TORAH. Adonai b'or panecha yalichun. That through in the light of your God, in the light of your countenance, will they walk. So we call the person who sounds the shofar, we call him the Baal Tekeah. We call the mitzvah Tekiyat Shofar. So why do we say here Ashrei Yodei TORAH? Specifically, there are 4 sounds of the shofar, right? We have the Tekiyah, which is the first whole complete sound. You have the shvarim, which are 3 short blasts, broken. You have the TORAH, which is 9 or 11, okay? Short blasts in succession. Also broken, sounds like crying. And then you have the Tekiyah Gadol at the end, the long, uninterrupted Tekiyah. So why specifically does this verse say, praised or praiseworthy are the people who know specifically the TORAH, the broken sound, the sound of wailing. What does that broken sound represent? Okay, so we're now going to learn on the bottom of the page, okay, 3 short teachings from 3 Hasidic masters. We're going to start with Rav Tzadok HaKohen Milublin in Resisei Laila. And Rav Tzadok says this beautiful idea that we're supposed to be aware of, and we're supposed to feel that we're experiencing metaphysically in those moments when the shofar is sounded. This is text number 8 on our sheets. Ube'et shebnei Yisrael tokim b'shofar, and that moment when the Jewish people sound the shofar, yesh ha'ara me'avar u'me'atid. There is an experience, a revelation from the past, and a glimpse at what? The future. Now listen how he explains this. It represents, the shofar represents the freedom that the Jewish people experienced and felt at that moment when we stood at Sinai, and we heard the shofar sounded when we stood at Sinai. Okay? And also, it also is what? Is a taste of the shofar of freedom that will be sounded when we greet Mashiach Tzidkeinu. V'atkiyat shofar ma'ora b'tocham nekuda shel cherut. And therefore, when we sound the shofar, okay, it's meant to what? Instill within us this connection to this idea of cherut. Cherut means freedom. It doesn't mean freedom physically, it means freedom emotionally, spiritually. Okay? The experience of sounding the shofar is a metaphysical bridge between that awesome moment when we stood at Har Sinai and heard the shofar, and that awesome moment that, please God, we'll soon experience, where we'll stand to greet Mashiach Tzidkeinu when we hear that great, awesome shofar sounded once again. Okay? So that's what Tzadok HaKohen. We're now going to learn from Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who takes us in a slightly different direction, also talking about the different sounds of the shofar. This is text number 9. So he says, O Yivoar, Tkiyah Shvarim Trua Tkiyah. He says, well, how do we sound the shofar? We have Tkiyah, Shvarim Trua, and Tkiyah. You have the whole sound, the 2 broken sounds, and then again, not just Tkiyah, but Tkiyah Gedola, a long, extended whole sound. And he says, we learn from the Ramban HaKadosh, Katav al Torah, in his writings on the Torah, Sheklalat Shebetorat Kohanim, Hu Romez HaChorban by Rishon, the Tochacha that we read in Parshat Bechukotai in the Sefer Vayikra, that's an allusion to the curses that we read in Sefer Vayikra, is an allusion to what? Chorban by Rishon. The fact that the Jewish people are given this warning that you'll experience curses, the first time we're given those warnings in Vayikra, that's a remiss to the fact that we're going to experience the tragedy of Chorban by Rishon. But what about the second time that we read last Shabbos in Parshat Kitavo, the second Tochacha? The klalot sheba Mishnah Torah are Chorban by Sheni. And the klalot that we read last Shabbos in Parshat Kitavo, that represents what? That represents, it's an allusion to what? Chorban Bayit Sheni, the second destroyed temple. Okay, so why does he use that as an introduction? See where he goes with this. He's going to talk about how the sounds of the shofar, the different sounds of the shofar, and the minhag, in terms of how we sound those different sounds, that's also an allusion to this experience of the Chorban Bayit. Look what Reb Levi Yitzchak says. The truth is that from Hashem, there's nothing bad, truly wicked that comes into the world. From our perspective, it might be what? Something horrible or damaging or painful. But in the great reality, the bigger picture, okay? The bigger picture, we take a step back. It's an idea we've shared many times in this year, okay? There's sometimes we have to take a step back and see the big picture. He says, you take a step back, that even those moments that seem like tragedies and painful moments and trauma, ultimately there's an ultimate good that's going to come from them. And look what he says. Rak kavanat korban bayit rishon, leave note Yisrael bayit sheni. Because the reason why the first bayit was destroyed is what? In order that we'll be able to one day build the second temple. V'chein chorban bayit sheni kedei lino bayit la'atid im yirtzeh Hashem b'yeter seit v'adar. And the second temple was destroyed, which will enable us, please God, to eventually build the third temple in the future, which will be even more beautiful and more splendid, says the Kedushas Levi. Okay? Listen what he says. Now, this is all represented by the sounds of the shofar. V'zeu tekiah rishona al ava rishona shu bayit rishon. The first tekiah that we sound, which is a sound of wholeness, of completeness. Okay? That represents the level of love that Hashem had when He bestowed us the capacity to build the first Beis HaMikdash. Okay? And then we go through Shofar and TORAH, the two broken sounds, which represent what? The two destroyed temples. V'zeh she'romez Rabbeinu Zal Ganoche Ganach Yululi Allah. Because this is represented by the idea of expressing our sadness and wailing. Okay. And then those sounds, those two broken sounds, represent what? Our wailing, our sadness, that sense of longing for the Beis HaMikdash. And now, Tekiah B'sof, the Tekiah Gadol at the end, Romez al Bayit Atid, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, B'yoter Hod V'hadar. The Tekiah Gadola, which we sound at the end, that's what? That reminds us, Yitaka b'shofar gadol l'cheirutenu, right? Just like Rav Tzadok said. It reminds us what? That when there will be a day, please God, soon in our days, where we'll sound the great shofar, a tekiah, not a broken sound, but we'll sound the tekiah God, tekiah gadola, a great tekiah, a whole tekiah, to greet Mashiach Tzidkenu. Okay, so just to review, we have what we've discussed. We talked about the spirit behind the sound. So far, we spoke about Sar Imenu. The shofar represents the cries of Sar Imenu and instills within us the chizuk, the confidence in knowing that Sar Imenu continues to call out. We're reminded when we hear the shofar that Sar Imenu continues to call out and advocate on our behalf in Shamayim. Okay? Then we learn from Rav Tzadok, who said that in those moments we hear the shofar sounded, we're taken back metaphysically to that awesome moment where we heard the shofar sounded, the freedom of emotion and spirit that we felt when we stood at Sinai and we heard the shofar sounded. And we're also reminded to be ready with anticipation for that awesome moment where we'll experience hearing that great shofar sounded as we greet Mashiach Tzidkenu. And then similarly, the Kedushas Levi talked about all the sounds representing the experience of both the broken moments and the overcoming the broken moments in Jewish history. That the sounds we begin with the sound of wholeness. When we have the Beis HaMikdash, we have the two broken sounds, which represent the destruction twice of the Beis HaMikdash. And then, please God, the Tekiah Gadol at the end represents what? Please God, that moment when we experience Binyan by Shlishi. Okay, so we're going to learn one last text together from the Nasiv Shalom, the Slonim Rebbe. This is text number 10, who's hopefully going to bring this all together. And the Slonim Rebbe actually introduces that there is a duality, okay, inherent in this mitzvah of Tekiah Shofar. There are two fundamental ideas that we're meant to have in mind and have the kavanah that we're experiencing when we hear the shofar. So take a look. This is text number 10. This is a unique call to us that happens one time a year, okay, to hear the shofar. Kol Hashem hayotze me'ashofar korei la'yehudi uru yishenu mishenatchem v'nirdamim hekitzu mitimodatchem. He says, the proverbial voice of God calls out to us from within the shofar and says to those of us who are, wake up from your sleep, jump out of your hibernation and slumber. Because if you've made mistakes, you can still do tshuva, you can still come back from those mistakes. But as the years, months and years pass, we get so comfortable in our slumber. We're so in such a deep spiritual slumber that it becomes more challenging us to come out of it. Skip the line. And this is the unique work that we need to do, spiritual work we need to experience on this day of Rosh Hashanah. And this is the idea we're meant to have in mind when we hear the sound of the shofar. L'akshiv l'kol Hashem. The shofar represents the proverbial voice of God calling out, hakorei la'yudi, that calls out to the Jew. Ba'kol shofar, through the sound of the shofar, kedei sheyichnesu advarim bi'oznei livava, in order that its message, these words, of that spiritual wake-up call, should enter into what? The proverbial ears of the chambers of our hearts. That's the first idea that the Slumber Rebbe introduces. That the shofar represents, metaphysically, the proverbial voice of God calling out to us. But there's another idea that's represented by the shofar. Listen to what he says here. V'od inyan yesh bo b'shofar. And there's another idea represented by the shofar. Litzkol ulashmiya kol shofar. To sound and hear the sounds of the shofar. We have to blow it and we have to hear it. As we explained earlier, shemitzvah tayom hi lashmiya et ha'anacha amitit mi'omek halev shel Yehudi hananach v'tzoek el Hashem Yitbarach. The mitzvah of the day is to hear the deep sigh the true sigh of an anguish of the heart of every single Jew who's sighing and calling out to Hashem. To what? To allow us to overcome whatever challenges we may be facing in our lives. The duality inherent in the proverbial sounds of the sounds of the shofar, says the son of a Rebbe, is this duality. On one hand, the shofar represents the proverbial voice of God calling out to us, wake up, you can always improve yourself. It's never too late. And simultaneously, the shofar represents and reminds us what? To hear the voices around us. Not just to hear the proverbial voice of God calling out to me, but hear the voices of our brothers and sisters calling out in anguish, who may be in need, who may be in trauma, who may need our love and concern. This, says the Slumber Rebbe, is the duality inherent within the profound sounds of the shofar. My friends, we began with those two beautiful stories of Rav Moshe Soloveitchik and Rav Kook, and the emotional tug, that push and pull between reverence and emotion that we have and that we feel during the experience of Tekiyat Shofar. And then as we learn from the later masters of Jewish thought, the more modern masters of Jewish thought, we see the shofar has many, many powerful messages inherent within us. Let's be blessed to take to heart all these beautiful messages as we get ready for the awesome day, as that moment where we'll sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. May we indeed be inspired to take to heart all these beautiful messages, and may we indeed be blessed to experience, as Rav Tzadok Cohen and the Kedushat Levi said so beautifully for us, that not only are we reminded of that awesome moment when we stood at Sinai and heard the shofar, and not only are the broken sounds remind us of all the trauma and tragedies we've experienced throughout our history, but may we be zocha to hear and sound the great shofar as we greet Mashiach Tzidkenu. Chag Sameach, Shana Tova.